Now we are going to look at the connections of the orbit. So before we go into the topic of connections, we have to understand what exactly is a connection, right? So previously we saw the boundaries, right? Boundaries are what we call as walls. Now what exactly are connections? Connections are like door, okay, doors. When we have to move from one room to another room, what do we have? We have doors, right? So similarly in our skull, okay, in our skull we have a lot of rooms. What are these rooms? We have orbit, we have nasal cavity, we have our fossas, right? What are the fossas? Example, we have temporal fossa, we have pterygopalatine fossa, okay, we have pterygoid fossa. We have a lot of fossas. Fossas are areas, okay, we have a lot of areas. And then of course we have our cranial vault. What is cranial vault? That is the area where your brain is present, right? Cranial cavity. So all these places has to be interconnected to each other, right? So this interconnection is through our connections or our doors, okay, that is what we call as connections. We have a canal starting from orbit connecting to the nasal cavity, that is connection between the orbit and nasal cavity, okay. We have a canal that is going to connect your orbit to your cranial vault, that is also a connection of the orbit, okay. Where and all, what and all areas are connected in your skull, that is what we call it as connections, okay. So now we are going to see specifically the connections of the orbit. So what does that mean? The orbit, our eye socket, okay, what all areas our orbit is being connected to, that is what we are going to see in the connections of orbit. So there are actually 11 connections, okay, and we have studied almost 90% of all these connections, okay. So the first connection that we are going to see is your orbital fissure, okay. And the orbital fissure you have studied already? Yes, of course, we studied in the sphenoid bone. When we were studying, we studied two orbital fissures. Actually we have two orbital fissures. The superior orbital fissure we studied when we were studying our sphenoid bone, and we have another one called as the inferior orbital fissure, which we will see right now, okay. And then after that we have our, in the frontal bone when we were studying, we had another foramen called as the supraorbital foramen and the infraorbital foramen in our maxilla bone, okay. So these are also the connections of orbit. And after that, in the sphenoid bone itself, while we were studying, we studied another canal that is in relation to your orbit, that is your optic canal. Do you remember optic canal? So that is also a connection of your orbit. The third connection which we have to know is actually in our ethmoid bone. In the ethmoid bone, we have anterior ethmoidal foramen and posterior ethmoidal foramen. Actually, in ethmoid, we have it as a sulcus. When connecting with our frontal bone, we make that into a foramen, right? So we have anterior and posterior for ethmoidal foramens, okay. And then we have in our zygomatic bone three foramens in our zygomatic bone, okay. They are your facial foramen, temporal foramen and your orbital foramen, okay. And then furthermore we have to know about a structure called as the canalis lacrimalis, nasolacrimal canal. Okay, and from the name itself you can understand it is connecting your nasal cavity to your lacrimal bone, right? So lacrimal bone is where? Lacrimal bone is in the orbit. That is why it is a connection of the orbit. So this connection you will study again in your nasal cavity connections also. Okay, so don't forget this one. So this is our 11 connections of the orbit. Nasolacrimal canal, zygomatic foramen 3, ethmoidal foramen 2, supraorbital foramen, infraorbital foramen, and then 3 structures relating to your sphenoid bone, that is your superior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure, and your optic canal. Okay, now we will go see all of these in detail, how it is going to be, where it is going to be, everything. Okay, over here we have our orbit. In this orbit, as we have already studied, we know the boundaries, everything, what all are the bones involved, everything is done. So now I'm going to mark just the connections. So the first connection that we studied was the orbital fissures, right? We have superior orbital fissure in our sphenoid bone. So this is our lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Okay, this is the greater wing of sphenoid. In between these two, this area which I'm marking in pink, okay, this area over here, that is your superior orbital fissure or fissura orbitalis superior. Okay, now below the greater wing of sphenoid and between the zygomatic bone, you have another vacant space. See the space that I am highlighting in yellow over here, this area. Okay, so that is going to be your inferior orbital fissure. Okay, where is the inferior orbital fissure? It is in between the greater wing of sphenoid and your zygomatic bone. Okay, where is the superior orbital fissure? That is going to be in between your lesser wing of sphenoid and your greater wing of sphenoid. Okay, so those are the two orbital fissures, superior and inferior. And then we talked about an optic canal. Remember, in the base of the minor wing of sphenoid, we have optic canal. So over here, you can see the optic canal as this one. Okay, so that foramen that you are seeing, that is your optic canal. And where is the optic canal present? It is present in the sphenoid bone, lesser wing. Okay, so that concludes our sphenoid components. We are moving on to the next one, that is your orbital foramen. Okay, superior orbital foramen and inferior orbital foramen. So they are named as foramen supraorbital and foramen infraorbital. We have a foramen above our orbit. We have a foramen below our orbit. Okay, the one above is called as foramen supra. Supra means above. Okay, supraorbital. And it is present in which bone? It is present in frontal bone. This is your frontal bone. Okay, that's your frontal bone. And then this one below, that is your fissure foramen infraorbital. Okay, and that is present in which bone? That is your maxilla bone. So no one told you life was gonna be. Okay, so that is your maxilla bone. Now these two are also going to be connecting your orbit into various areas. Okay, so your maxilla, in the maxilla, the infraorbital foramen is actually going inside like this, and it is coming out over here. Can you see this depression over here? See, on the other side there's a foramen over there. Okay, so it is going to connect your face to your orbit. Okay, the nerves which is going to come to your face that is going to go through the inferior border, this border of the orbit, and it is going to come out from the infraorbital foramen. Same way, the nerves that have to come to your forehead, this is your forehead, right, this area, okay, that area, the nerves are going to come out through the supraorbital foramen, through here, okay, and it is going to connect your orbit to the brain. That is why those are also the connections of orbit. So once again, just the 5 components which we studied right now. We have the superior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure, optic canal, foramen supraorbital, and foramen infraorbital. Okay, 5 points now. Over here I will write the legend. Number 1 was your superior orbital fissure. Number 2 is your inferior orbital fissure. Number 3 is your optic canal. Number 4 is your supraorbital foramen. And number 5 is your infraorbital foramen. The rest of the connections will be covered in another video. Okay.